All right, we're about down to the shift in Corinthians, but as we get into these last two chapters before that shift, once again, the focus of this letter kind of changes. You know, he's really talking about unity, his love he had, a lot of the idea of where he got his comfort and a lot of those things. But then we start getting down into, chapter 8 and 9, the focus of this letter comes once again back to the money. So some people think that 8 and 9 were part of another letter. So I don't know. There's a lot of theories, but maybe not. It kind of flows along with it, but it is very much about the money. This money to Jerusalem. And this is important to Paul. He's collecting this. He's going to these areas. He's going to these churches. He's going to Galatia. He's going to all these different places, and he's collecting this money. Talks about Macedonia here, which would be like the Thessalonica church, that area of the world. Talks about going there. Talks about gathering money there, and he's prodding them for money. So this is important to Paul, and I think it's not so much that it has to do with unity. You know, it's not, this is about unity between Gentile and Jewish churches, and I know we probably shouldn't say that, but at this particular point in history, that's a real thing. So, you know, you've got these Jewish churches in Jerusalem that are very Jewish. I mean, they're Christians, but they're still holding on to these Jewish laws. They're still wanting to circumcise. They're still wanting to keep these feasts. They're still wanting to do these things that are Jewish. This is a real struggle. We see this in Acts 22, right, where Paul gets imprisoned because of this. So this is something that's a real thing, and Paul wants to unify them. He wants them to understand they're all on the same side. They're all on the same team. He wants them to support one another. He wants them to have a participation with one another. And it's important to him, I think, on that side, because he wants to show the Jewish church, who's still skeptical of the Gentiles and skeptical of the Gentile churches, that the Gentile churches love them and the Gentile churches want to help them. And how better to show that than by this gift of money at this time when Judea, these Jerusalem churches, are in this famine and they need this money. So they're hurting and they need this gift. And Paul understands that. And Paul is trying to bring this in fruition. And it's really a big ministry. And it's a big ministry because of time and because of space and distance and all these things that Paul's trying to put together here. To gather this money and to carry it long distances at that time is hard, dangerous work to carry large amounts of money. And so there's a lot of logistics involved in this. And Paul is writing these letters. He's cajoling these churches to donate to this money that they're going to carry to the church in Jerusalem. And that's, when you get into 8 and 9 of 2 Corinthians, that's really what we're talking about here. And it's really a fundraising section. And a little different than we see in other places of the Bible. It kind of tells us some things about giving. Brethren, we wish to make known to you the grace of God. Okay, the church of Macedonia. See, Paul's in Macedonia now, so like I said, that's the Thessalonica church. That's the other ones are eluding me, but that's that area of the world. Paul's familiar with that. He's been there. He's ministered there. There are people that know him, but that's a poor region. That's a lot poorer region than Corinth. Corinth is wealthy. Corinth is a wealthy city, a big city. Certain cities are wealthy, right? And certain cities aren't, just like today. And Macedonia is not a real wealthy part of the world. And so he's holding up this area, this Macedonia area, he's holding that up to them as kind of I shouldn't say a benchmark. He's not asking them to give the same amount, but I think he's asking them to make the same sacrifice, if that makes any sense. And of course, the sacrifice of someone who doesn't have money is a lot less than monetarily wise than the sacrifice of someone who does have money, if that makes any sense. The widow's mite, right? It's all she had. So even though it wasn't a lot, it was a lot. And you know what I'm saying. So this is what he's saying. So in this holding them up to them, he says, their abundance of joy, their deep poverty overflowed in wealth of their liberality. In other words, you know, he expresses to them this poverty that they're in, and yet they gave out of their poverty, out of their need. He says that they gave beyond their ability. So they stepped up here. Paul's holding them up because Corinth is a wealthy church. He's saying these people out of their poverty gave above what they were able, right? Begging us with much urging for the favor of participation and support of the saints. So he's playing them against one another a little bit here, is what he's doing. They're urging the participation. In other words, they want to participate with you. They want to show that they're giving as you're giving. He's holding them against one another a little bit. We had expected, but they first gave themselves to the Lord and to us by the will of God. In other words, we didn't make them do it. That's what Paul's trying to say here. We didn't make them. They did it. We urged Titus, as he had previously made beginning, so to go back. So this is where he's talking about sending Titus back to Corinth to get the Corinthian donation. So Titus has been there, and he says, now we're going to send him back to you so that he can complete this that you've been given. Because remember, we talk about 1 Corinthians 16:2, right? Lay by and store is, right, this idea in the first day of the week, which was part of this contribution. They've been building this up for a while. There's a period of time here. So this is probably a pretty large sum of money by the time that Paul is actually going to get it. He says, just you abound in everything, faith, utters, knowledge, earnestness. He's building them up, as we would do with somebody I want to get money from, right? But he's telling them, proving through the earnestness of others, the sincerity of your love. So he's going to send this letter. This could be a letter by itself. We don't know. 8 and 9 could be a letter by itself. But he's going to send this, and maybe it's all part from, maybe it starts in 1 and goes to 9. I don't know. But he's going to send this with Titus. They're going to read this letter. He's cajoling them to give, right? To give more money. That though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you might through his poverty become rich. I give my opinion in this matter, for this is to your advantage, who were the first to begin a year ago, not only with this, but also with the desire to do it. So see, this is a period. This began a year ago. So it gives you a little time frame between 1 Corinthians and this particular letter and our part of 2 Corinthians. It gives you a little bit of a time. So they've been gathering this up for a year. And now it's time for Titus to pick it up and to carry it back to Jerusalem. But now finish it, right? Finish this. Do the completion of your ability. Send this money, right? Gather up the rest of this. He says this is not for the ease of others and for your affliction, but by way of equality. In other words, it's about participation, about all of them doing this, all of us sending, all these churches, and being equal with the other churches by showing their love, by showing this gift that they're going to send to this church in Jerusalem. It's kind of a mushy deal, It's what you would think if you were trying to raise money. It's kind of flattering, a little mushy, a little bit cajoling, a little bit step up and do. Look at what this poor church did. You should be able to do better than that. Give your sacrifice. Paul's really, but what I see when I read this, kind of getting that out of the way. What I see when I read this is how important this is to Paul. Right? I mean, it's important to the church in Judea, I'm sure. I mean, they're in a famine. They need the money. But they're not writing them, right? Paul's the one writing them. The church in Judea is not sending a letter to Corinth saying, boy, we're sure in a famine. We sure need help, right? Paul is the one, this intermediary in the middle of this saying, oh, you need to help them. Why? Why? Because Paul is trying to bring these people together. Paul is on a mission here, and the mission is not money. The mission is bringing them together. The mission is investing them in one another, right? Because when you do that, you have some skin in the game, right? They've invested in each other. That's what Paul wants them to do. He says, your abundance being a supply for their need, so that their abundance may also become a supply for your need, that there may be equality. Now, Paul doesn't not talking about monetarily abundance. he's talking about their spiritual abundance. In other words, you're supplying them monetarily, they can supply you spiritually. There's an equality because you're equal in the body. He who gathered much did not have too much. He who gathered little had no lack, pulls out of the Old Testament. But thanks be to God who puts the same earnestness on your behalf in the heart of Titus. So once again, building this up, Titus is going to come. He's letting them know here, Titus is coming from him. Titus is supposed to complete this work. Titus is supposed to get the money. This is Paul's seal to say this is how this is supposed to happen. So Paul's putting this in place, right? He's gone to you of his own accord. In other words, Paul said, I don't forced him to go collect this money from you. I forced him to do it. And then he says, I'm going to send, and this is kind of an interesting part of this chapter. He says, I'm going to send along a brother who has fame in things of the gospel, but he doesn't say who he is. So we don't know who he is. And I always thought that was kind of interesting. And I don't know who it is either. Maybe it was Apollos. Maybe it was, I don't know. I don't know who it was. And it's interesting that Paul doesn't name him. And people say, why didn't he name him, right? Why didn't he just tell him who it was going to be? And I don't have a good answer for that. But whoever this is well known. He's been appointed by the churches to travel with us in this gracious work, which is being administered by us for the glory of the Lord and to show our readiness. But it says he's been appointed by the churches. What churches? The church of Macedonia, to travel with us in this gracious work. So we don't know who this guy is, who this brother is, but apparently he's quite famous. So, and he's going to come with Titus. That's another ploy, right? If you want to raise money, send a keynote speaker, right? Send somebody that's well known, send somebody that has some influence. Paul's not going, so I'm going to send this other famous guy. And you need to, right? And that's going to help cajole you to give because you're going to be impressed, right? You're going to be impressed by this guy, and he's going to help you to do this. He says, taking precautions. So in other words, more than one person. I think that's important here. He says, this guy that I'm sending, whoever this famous brother is, he's going to help to prove to you that we're not going to use this wrong, this gift. It's not going to one person, right? In other words, this guy we're sending, you trust him, he's famous, he's well known. He's going to help to prove to you that this money that you're going to give is actually going to wind up where you need it to go. We're actually doing this for the right reason. This is actually going to Judea. This is actually going to be what we say it's going to be. It's a security in a way that says, oh yeah, we're just not going to take this money and run off with it. We're actually going to take this money to Judea. We're going to give it to the churches there. This is going to work out. And that's important, right? Because we want that. Even when we give, we want that assurance that the money we give is going to actually go to what we want it to go to. And we give a lot of money that we don't know that, which is disturbing to me. But nevertheless, it's one of those things that we fundraising, giving money as a Christian is a tough business. You really need to research where you give your money to and who you give your money to, because there's a lot of people with their hands out. And a lot of those organizations are really top-heavy, if you know what I mean. And you really got to be careful about that. I think that, I can't remember which one it is, one of the real famous. You have to ask Gary. He did some research on that one time, but I think it might have been Feed the Children or one of those. I can't remember. But one of those that's really popular. It's always on TV. And they have to provide that information if you ask for it. They have to provide their financials, by law, if you ask for it. And Gary did that. You can talk to him about it. He's not in here, but he did that for several of those really big, like, UNICEF and Feed the Children, and I can't think of the others. But, there's 4 or 5 of them that are really big organizations. And he did that, and honestly, I can't remember which one, but a couple of those, administrative fees on them was like 85%. So basically, 15% of the dollar was actually going to go to somebody. 85% of it was going to the organization. So I mean, we give money we give money all the time and don't know. And I think it's really funny because I feel like towards the end of my kids' school career, I really got skeptical of this fundraising stuff, and I really started to question, where's this money actually going? I mean, we're selling candy bars and we're selling, and where's, who's actually getting this money? Where's that money at? And I never could get a good answer. And I really got frustrated with it towards the end, and I got a little ugly about it. But because it got really, really irritating to me that, my kids were out selling these candy bars and stuff or whatever they were selling, and I couldn't figure out where exactly that money was winding up. What were we actually buying with that money? Show me what we're actually doing with this money. And I couldn't get those answers. And it got really frustrating to me. And eventually I said, if you need pencils for your classroom, come ask me and I'll go buy you whatever. I'd rather do that than buy a candy bar that I don't know, where that money's actually going. You understand what I'm saying? It's easy to give money to people, but you need to know where it's going in the end, right? I mean, you need to know what the end result is of your money. And most things we don't really know that, and that's something we should know. I think as Christians, we should be stewards of what we give. That's why Paul's trying to assure them here that, okay, this money is going to Judea. We're not taking it. We're not spending it on something else. And to prove this to you, I'm putting these people, other people involved in this, so that you can be assured that this is what's going to happen. And that's important, right? Transparency. We would call that transparency. And that's important. So it says, we have sent with them our brother, whom we have often tested and found diligent in many things, but now even more diligent because of his great confidence in you. So he's building this guy up, whoever he is. He's really building him up to be this guy who's going to be trustworthy, who's going to assure their donation is going to go there, somebody they respect, somebody they trust. And so this guy's going to come with Titus. Then he says, Titus is my partner. Paul calls him his partner here. Paul wants them to know he's involved in this. They are messengers of the churches. Therefore, openly before the churches, show them the proof of your love and our reason for boasting about you. So in other words, he's saying, so give them your money. Give them this donation. This is one of the few places in the Bible we really talk a lot about money. So it's kind of interesting, right? What's going on here. It's superfluous for me to write to you about this ministry to the saints. For I know your readiness, of which I boast about you. See, he's building them up. This is a lot of what these two chapters are. He's building them up, right? It says, namely that Achaia has been prepared since last year, and your zeal has stirred up most of them. So they've been prepared, so they're ready. This other money is ready. We're to the end of this thing. I sent the brethren in order that our boasting about you may not be made empty. So it's not just Paul is holding these other churches up to Corinth and saying, look how good they're doing. Paul's holding Corinth up to these other churches and saying, oh, look how good they're doing, right? Paul's playing them against each other here. He's playing them against one another a little bit. Otherwise, if any from Macedonians come to me and find you prepared, say, oh, so the Macedonians come and find out that, oh, well, I really wasn't telling the truth. You're really not prepared, right? Then I'm going to be put to shame by that. So don't put me to shame, Have it together. If the Macedonians come and check on this, I want to know that you've got it together. Don't put me to shame. So I thought it necessary to urge the brethren that they would go on ahead to you and arrange beforehand your previously promised bountiful gift. So he says, I'm going to send them, I want to get this all in place so that when the Macedonians come, if the Macedonians see it, they're going to say, oh, well, Paul was right. So that the same would be ready as a bountiful gift. Bountiful. See how he uses that word? He wants it to be a lot. Now I say, he who's supposed to spare will reap. He's wanting it bountifully. Once again, the word comes up. Paul really wants this gift to be an impressive amount. This has been going on for a year. He's wanting this to be, this is like the Jerry Lewis telethon when they used to raise the little red thing, right? I mean, he's wanting them to hit the little top of the thermometer. I don't know if they had thermometers in ancient Greece, but he wants to hit the top of the thermometer, right? This is a big thing. I hope you see, I think when you read these two chapters, that's what you should see. This is a huge thing to Paul. And he says, we use this scripture all the time, don't we? 1 Corinthians 9:7. Must you just see his purpose in his heart, not grudgingly under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. You know, that's one verse we pick out of this. We use that verse all the time. We also use, 1 Corinthians 16:2, right? Lay by and store in the first week, right? And we use those scriptures all the time. And both those scriptures have to do with this gift. So we don't really use them very contextually, I would say. But they are good. I mean, they do make sense. Paul's right. I'm not saying this isn't right, but saying there's context. The two passages we use most about giving came out of both these Corinthian letters. 1 Corinthians 16:2, lay by in the first week as you've prospered, which is talking about this gift. And then 2 Corinthians 9:7, each one of you must also use purpose in his heart, not grudging or compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. Those are probably our two favorite giving passages in the Bible, and both of them have to deal with this Jerusalem gift specifically. That's what he's talking about here. Not talking about what you give every Sunday for the church. We use them that way, okay? But this really talking about this Jerusalem gift here. God is able to make grace abound. Once again, he continues to build them up. He continues to tell them to give. It's a lot of this. Well, you see it. It's a giving letter. I mean, exactly what it is. Cajoling them, asking them to give, not just give, but give bountifully, give purposefully, give in confidence, because this money's going to get to where it needs to go. Paul says you've been blessed in Christ, bless other people. It's just one of those letters. There's just this little part in here. He says, give me this ministry, I glorify God for your obedience to your confession of the gospel and for the liberality of your contribution. You see these words, bountiful, liberality. You see these words, right? You see what he's doing. He says, what's the money? So I know I didn't spend a lot of time in those two chapters. You can read them, but you get the gist of it. They're giving. It's the two giving chapters in the middle of 2 Corinthians that probably don't fit there, honestly. So because you get down through, you get down to into 7, and then all of a sudden in 8, we go into this giving, right? We go into these two giving chapters that almost don't hardly fit. And then in 10, we just shift gears. That's how come people think, and you'll see it here, that's how come people think 10 down to the end of 2 Corinthians was not part of the original letter. Some people think 10 down was part of the sorrowful letter that Paul mentions earlier in 2 Corinthians, and maybe so. So once again, I will read this to you once again. While most scholars believe that chapters 1 through 9 are a unity, and that's probably not true, there's a lot of debate about that. Most scholars believe 1 through 7 are a unity, and a lot of people believe 8 and 9 were part of another letter, or a letter on its own, and then most scholars believe 10 through 13 are another letter. So I know that's confusing, but if you kind of look at it, I think you'll see it. It says it must be part of another letter sent earlier as a letter of tears, or later after the interlopers had caused further erosion in the relationship between Paul and the Corinthians. The warm, heartfelt relief expressed in chapter 7, followed by the confidence that the Corinthians will complete their pledge for the collection in chapters 8 and 9, abruptly changes to more strident temper in 10 through 13. Paul is on the defensive, and his self-defense as a fool constitutes a bitter reproach to the Corinthians. Does one castigate people immediately after asking them to contribute to a fund? I would say probably not, right? If you just read what I read in 7 and or in 8 and 9, then I don't think you start 10, you're going to say, I wouldn't put that after 8 and 9. I mean, I don't think anybody would do that. So you'll see it. Anyway, so it says some scholars argue the sarcastic tone of chapters 10 and 13 and the torrent reproaches of 12, 20, and 21 sound more like the sorrowful letter Paul spoke about in 2, 3, and 4, and 7, 8. If the sorrowful letter was more reproachful than this, it must have been a scorcher. Paul's explanation in 13:4 that he writes this letter so he may not have to be severe in his use of authority when he comes seems to match the description of the painful letter in 2:9. The reason I wrote to you was to see if you would stand the test and be obedient in everything. So we know we have this sorrowful letter that were mentioned in chapter 2, 3, and 4 of 2 Corinthians, and chapter 7, verse 8. And a lot of people think that 10 through 13, if not that sorrowful letter, are a part of that sorrowful letter. And most people, as we read 10 through 13, if his letter was harsher than this, it was bad, because 10 through 13 is pretty rough. It's pretty rough. And I think you would probably agree you would not write this after you wrote what I just wrote to you in 8 and 9. You just wouldn't do it. If you're trying to get people to give money, you're not going to send this. This is not going to help your case. Paul's harsh here, very harsh. And maybe worse than 1 Corinthians. He says, I'm bold towards you when I'm absent, right? I'm meek with you face to face. That's kind of a rough way to start. But he says, I'm bold towards you when I'm not there. In other words, I'm going to be bold. This is going to be rough, right? Because I ask when I am present, I need not be bold with the confession with which I propose to be courageous against some who regard as if we walked according to the flesh. So he doesn't mind confronting them. He doesn't mind confronting them, but he says, I ask when I'm present, I need not be bold with the confidence. In other words, he wants this letter to change what's causing the problem that he's upset about. He doesn't want to have to be bold with them face to face. He would rather they corrected this problem. That's Paul's idea here. Fix what's wrong. Then when I come see you, I won't have to be bold to your face. Not that he wouldn't be, because he would, but he says, I would rather not. I would rather not have to meet you that way. I would rather you take care of this problem. And the problem, if we jump back, the problem says who regard us as if we walked according to the flesh. Why do you think that means? What does it mean? Why would Paul say, how do we walk according to the flesh? Why would they accuse Paul of that? Could be the money. Could be some of the money problems. Could be, maybe all that. Maybe I'm greedy. Maybe they're accusing Paul of being greedy, taking some of that money. Maybe, possibly, right? There's a lot of things in the world that are according to the flesh, right? Could be money. Could be something to do with the flesh. Could be lust. Could be all these different things. Jealousy, pride. A lot of different things to be going on here. Whatever it is, Paul says that be courageous against some who regard us as if we walk according to the flesh. For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare, not of the flesh, but divinely powerful for the destruction of fortress. We are destroying speculations and every lofty thing raised up against the knowledge of God. We are taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. So Paul says we're not going to war according to the flesh. Now that's an interesting statement, because Paul, as we read through this, Paul is on the defense here. Paul is defensive. Paul's being attacked by people within this church for some reason. Paul's being set upon. Maybe his very apostleship is being questioned. His walk with God's being questioned. His sincerity is being questioned. Who he is with God's being questioned. And Paul, you and I, if we're attacked, we tend to want to attack back, don't we? We tend to want to attack back. And generally, we use the weapons of the flesh to attack back to somebody else. If somebody attacks us, in our mind, we might think up all these different ploys to try to get back at them because we want retribution. Paul says, we'll not war according to the flesh. Paul says, we're not going to come and fight with you. We're not going to wish ill upon you. We're not going to devise human schemes against you. We're not going to do that. That's not how we operate. We're going to fight you with the Word of God, with prayer, with our reputation, with these words that I'm sending you. We're not going to war with you in a fleshly manner. We're not going to come to fists about this, but we have weapons that are more powerful than that at our disposal. And that weapon is, of course, is God himself. We have righteousness on our side, truth on our side, and those weapons are the weapons we're going to use to bring down this attack that's being levied against us. This is a very defensive letter. Paul's defending himself here. Paul's being attacked here by people, and Paul is defending himself against those attackers. It's a very defensive 3 chapters. And it's really a learning curve here, because it's a great piece of Scripture, because basically we're all at some point going to be attacked. How do we respond to that, right? How do we deal with attacks that come against us and attacks that come against our faith, our reputation? How do we deal with that as Christians? Are we going to stand up? Are we going to call people out? Are we going to point fingers and name names and threaten to go beat people up? I mean, is that our mythology to fight things as a Christian? No, it's not. And we should never be that person. And trust me, I'm about as, I don't know a good word for me, but Buck's laughing, but I'm a very physical person that way. I grew up fighting. I don't know what else to tell you. I grew up fighting, and I grew up in fist fights all the time, and that's the way I grew up. That's the way I was raised. My dad was a tough man, and he said, you fight your own battles, and that's what I did. And for me, sometimes not to be a physical person when I'm mad that's a real battle for me. I mean, y'all may not know that because y'all don't see that side of me in it, but I'm just being honest. That's a real struggle for me. I'm a very hot-tempered person, and I fight that every day of my life. So I understand this, where Paul's coming from. I understand this that's welling up inside of him, this to be attacked, to want to defend yourself. I feel that. That's passion. It's I don't know how to say it. I can feel it inside of me. I know what Paul's feeling. He wants to set this right in a godly way, but every fiber of his being is fighting that godly way. He's fighting a battle here. Paul's fighting a battle in these chapters. As he fights the battle with them, he's fighting a battle within himself, because that's how we are as Christians. The flesh always wants to win. The flesh always wants to win. Okay, and so Paul understands this, and I can really get into this, because I feel, even as I read this, it's funny because, and maybe I'm a lot different than you guys, and that's okay, but when I start into 10, I start getting mad. I mean, I feel it in me right now. When I start into chapter 10, I start getting mad, because I know exactly, I can just feel Paul writing this. I just know I can feel what's inside of him when he writes this, and I know he's mad. He is. I mean, he's really mad here. I mean, maybe you don't see that, but the very way he writes it, the very way he puts it down, it tells you that he's really mad. And he's trying to approach this in a good way, but inside of him, he's like, I just want to come down there and whoop you guys, right? I mean, that's what he's thinking, right? I mean, I'm just being honest. But he's like, okay, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to fight you with the flesh. I'm going to do this the right way. But if you look at 5, we are destroying speculations and every lofty thing raised up against the knowledge of God. We are taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. We are destroying speculations and every lofty thing. You get the tone of this letter, the tone of what he's saying? You know, they're speculating things against him that aren't true. They're slandering his name. They're calling into question his apostleship. They're calling in, more than that, they're calling into question his very faith, his relationship with God, his obedience to the gospel. They're attacking him on the very basic level of what Paul is, and he's mad. And I would be too. Because they're attacking the very core of what he is, the very core of his being. And if you look at 6, we're ready to punish all disobedience whenever your obedience is complete. Paul has spoke to them about turning people over to Satan, hasn't he, in his letters? He's talked about putting people out of the church in his letters, right? In 1 Corinthians, he talked about putting them out of the church. He talked about turning them over to Satan. Paul is not above this idea of, yes, there's a physical punishment for a spiritual infraction. Did I say that right? There's a physical punishment for a spiritual infraction. Paul's not against that. Paul understands the idea of church discipline and the idea of what maybe needs to be done. But Paul doesn't want that to happen. Paul doesn't want to war this in the flesh. Paul wants to bring them back to where they need to be. Paul doesn't want to drive them away. Paul wants to bring them closer. In every fiber of his being, he's trying to do this, and it's a war within himself. He's a very sarcastic guy, Paul, if you read his writings. He's a very sarcastic guy. He's a guy who wants to get things done. He's a guy who accomplishes a lot. He's a guy, and this is in his way. Just telling you. This is in his way. You know, if you're a person that likes to get stuff done, when something gets in your way, you want it out of your way, right? And this is in his way. I'm just telling you. This is in the way of his ministry. It's in the way of his relationship to Corinth, and possibly stretches beyond that. So this is a really big thing to him. We are looking at things as they are outwardly. If anyone is confident in himself that he is Christ, let him consider this again within himself, that just as he is Christ, so also are we. Even if I boast somewhat further about our authority. And see, I think that's maybe the root of this, is they're questioning Paul's apostleship. They're questioning his authority to lead them in a spiritual way. Paul started that church. They should look to him. And yet, these other people, we call them interlopers, these other people have came in, and they're undermining Paul, undermining his authority. But when they do that, what are they really doing? Because if Paul is really God's apostle, and Paul's leading them in the way they should go, and Paul's teaching them God's truth, and these other people are coming in and undermining what Paul's saying, then they're leading them away from the truth of God. You see what I'm saying? But the only way they can do that, the only way you can change, I'm going to say this wrong. The only way you can change truth is to change the source, kind of, if that makes any sense. You know, in other words, if Paul's telling you this is what you need to do, and this is how you need to live, and this is how you need to give, and this is who you need to be, and I want to challenge the truth that Paul's giving you, the best way for me to do that is to undermine the authority of Paul. Right? If I can convince you that Paul's really not God's apostle, that God's really not giving you what God wants you to hear, that Paul's really not God's messenger, then I can convince you that the things Paul's telling you are not true to God, because the authority, Paul's authority, is lacking. And if I can convince you of that, then I can interject another truth or a false truth, and I can override these things that Paul has been telling you, you see? So Paul is defending here. He's defending his authority. They're undermining somebody in this church, or a group of people in this church. They are questioning the apostleship and authority of Paul so that they can interject a false truth, a false teaching, and get away with it. you see. So Paul's fighting for this whole church. So if Paul goes against this person, this individual or group, physically, if he goes against them to punish them, then he's going to divide the church, number one, right? And in a sense, he could almost make them look right. He could almost martyr them, if that makes any sense. He could almost, you see what I'm saying? If he acknowledges it to the point that he does it, then he could almost build them up instead of getting them back to where they need to be. This is complicated. We'll talk about it more next Sunday morning. Thanks for your time.